Hello, everyone. All right, so let's get back into this now. We've gone through chapter 3 in the database systems concepts textbook. I've talked about, by the way, that there's parts of that are covered in the Headfirst SQL book that I really like. So these stars are basically the chapters. These black stars are the chapters of Headfirst SQL that largely overlap with chapter 3. And so, by the way, you can kind of see, I think it's interesting that you've got this other book on how to use SQL, and it spreads out what is one chapter's worth of material in a textbook into a lot more pages. Now, part of that is because Headfirst SQL uses all sorts of nice pictures and things along those lines. It gives exercises for you to test your knowledge and stuff on there. But it's also because the textbook is a very condensed explanation of things. I don't know about you. Again, when I've had to learn things in the past, sometimes I find textbooks or other material that explains more of the steps to be more useful. It's just like a professor who goes over the work on how to derive something, and they skip steps and you're like, I'm lost. I think the textbook goes a little quick at times. So if you're looking for more explanation and also more of the details and the practical know-how of dealing with SQL, I recommend, again, the Headfirst SQL book. Yeah, and particularly if you're like, I don't know how to solve this problem. You can look in the textbook. That might not solve the problem for you. Of course, I hope the lectures have helped, but again, that might still not solve the problem. You can always ask for some help on Campus Wire. That's great. But I do recommend this book. Now, we're going to move into chapter 4, following the progression of the textbook. We're not going to cover every part of chapter 4, though. We're going to deal with 4.1 next, which is the notion of the outer join. This is a good part of chapter 10 in Headfirst SQL. All right. We've already talked about self-joins in chapter 3. We'll talk about transactions. That's part of chapter 11 in Headfirst SQL. We'll talk about constraints. That's part of chapter 11 in Headfirst SQL. I'll talk very briefly about dates, defaults, and auto increment. Those are topics that are scattered in the various chapters. For example, I think they might have the auto increment in the chapter 4 of the Headfirst SQL. And then we'll talk a bit about having an index on your table or multiple indexes on your table. I'm not sure where Headfirst SQL has that, if at all, but we'll talk about that briefly. I got these notes here. So chapter 5 in Headfirst SQL is all about when you have an existing schema. So in other words, we already have made a database. We've got all these tables, and they reference each other and so forth and so on. And then you decide, oh, I'd like to add a column to that table, or I need to delete a column from that table. That's what chapter 5 is all about, how to issue these alter statements. We actually, again, have for the most part, given a very cursory look at the create statements, how to create the tables. Again, a good portion of this is because we're just going to go ahead and when we get around to creating a bunch of tables, I'm largely going to save that for our work in Rails. And it's the conceptual notion of creating tables is not difficult, and it doesn't really change from doing it in SQL and doing it in Rails. So there's no good point in covering a lot of it in detail right now. Making tables is not hard. You're just basically saying, I want to name the table this, and I want the columns to be this, and I want these constraints. So we can just look that up when we need to figure it out. How to alter and modify, that's there. So, but these, chapter 4 and chapter 7 in Headfirst SQL, this is about table design and then about database design. These are topics that we're really going to dive much more into after we get through the material in chapter 4. There are some latter, you'll see if you look at the textbook, there's this beginning section, which is sort of how to get data out of an existing database, and then they've got stuff about how to create tables in there. But sure, we talked a bit about keys. We've got our super keys and our candidate keys and our primary keys. We talked about those in an earlier lecture. But what we really haven't talked about much is I have this problem that I want to solve. And it's going to have a bunch of data. And I know I need to save that data. How do I go about deciding what are the tables and what to put in the tables? And, I think one person asked on Campus Wire, why not just one big table? And again, we're going to dive into that and give you a methodology. It's the big chapter is the entity relationship diagramming, which is a drawing, making diagrams technique that when we follow that process, we usually end up with a pretty doggone good database design. In particular, if we remember to keep our attributes atomic, which we've already talked about. So we're going to move into that. Right now, we're spending our time working with existing schemas and how can we get the data out of an existing schema. So learning how to query, basically, how to update, how to insert, those are the key things that we're doing right now. Anyway, so this is an overview of this would be required reading. This is sort of a map and a guide to where and what's going on with this other book, where at the moment I don't have any required reading for it. I might have us do chapter 7 in Headfirst SQL because I think it is much more understandable than the same material in the Database Systems Concepts textbook. And I think it does a decent job of explaining it without confusing matters. So this may become something I explicitly assign as reading. All right, so with that outline available for us, what we're headed into here, we're going to start next with the outer join.